and welcome to a new episode of the Computomics podcast. Our guest today is Executive Manager of Plans for the Future ETP, Amrit Nanda. Welcome.
Thank you.
Amrit, it's lovely to have you here. I know you've done a lot of things already professionally, and you've lived in Denmark, Australia, Japan, I think the Philippines, Sweden, and now Belgium. And I'm sure you've traveled to even more places. As an icebreaker, what is a favorite travel memory of yours?
I think Japan was my favorite. Just the food, the culture, and the landscape is just gorgeous. I think there's no comparison.
Oh, wow. I haven't been, so now
I highly recommend it.
Definitely going to try and do that. Switching to what you do now, you're the Executive Manager of Plans for the Future ETP. For those who don't know, what is Plans for the Future ETP?
Yeah, so basically ETP stands for European Technology Platform, which sounds very technical. But basically, we are a platform at EU level that works to bring the research between the public sector and the private sector together to find common solutions in specific sectors. So there's a number of different ETPs focusing on different sectors, and we're the ones representing plans, hence Plans for the Future.
Mm-hmm. Can you maybe summarize all the areas that you're active in? Because just from your website, I already know there are quite a few.
Yeah, so basically, so maybe I can add, we're a multi-stakeholder platform. So we have members, and they are from academia and research institutes, so the public research in the plant sector, also from industry, so mostly the seed and breeding sector, but also agricultural service providers and technology developers. And we also represent the farmers and the cooperatives. So we basically have these groups that come together, and our common mission is basically to provide strategic direction in terms of research and innovation needs at EU level within the plant sector, and especially around plant breeding. We also try to promote science-based policymaking, because we can have the best research in the world. If the legislations aren't adapted so that we can make the best use of them, then we're not doing much. And then finally, one of our very big roles that we've been investing a lot of new resources on is science communication, because there is a general lack of awareness of the role that plant breeding plays in our society, in our food systems. And it's something that, it's part of our civilization. Without plant breeding, we wouldn't have been able to evolve the way we have. So we try to bring that message across to the general public.
Mm-hmm. Can you maybe give us an example of how you do that? So how do you get that across?
So we develop different materials. So my colleague Barbara, who's our research and communication officer, she develops what we call Plantastic Discoveries series that we have on social media. So mostly through LinkedIn, but we're also on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky now. And basically, we explain a little bit the stories of, we try to take some complex topics and we boil them down to like nice visuals, a little cartoonish about what it actually means. We just launched 2 weeks ago our campaign specifically focusing on plant breeding as the heart of our agri-food systems. And so we're going to deep dive every 2 weeks on a specific aspect of solutions that plant breeding brings across the value chain.
That's quite a big field, again, that you're covering there. Can you give maybe an example, like one of the more recent ones?
Yeah, so we published, I think it was last week, we published one where we looked at the role of plant breeding, the benefits it brings at the consumer level. For example, also linked to the bioeconomy, because it's not only about food and feed, but the biomass left over from the plants actually provides a lot of benefits, for example, for textiles, for energy, for pharmaceuticals, building material, a million different things. And actually plant breeding can play a role in how to optimize that biomass so that it's more sustainable and more usable.
Mm-hmm. And how's the reception? I know sometimes that's the part that's harder to track, I guess, but how's the reception of these science communication efforts?
Well, I think we're getting a lot of visibility. And I also hear when I meet different people, they follow it. And if we, for example, skip a week, then we hear about it. People are like, where was the Plantastic Discovery? So that's very nice. We've also actually on our website put a dedicated page that we call our information hub, where we've put all in PDF format, downloadable, all our previous posts on Plantastic Discoveries and other similar post campaigns, so people can have a look and see old ones. But basically, we've seen also, the benefits of investing in having a dedicated communication officer, because since we've had someone on board, we've almost tripled our following in LinkedIn within a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
So we do see that there's some uptake. Of course, it's difficult because we reach people within our sector. We do reach some people outside, but within social media, it's very hard to break out of that bubble. But we're trying, and I think we are getting there a little bit at a time.
Mm-hmm. I'd especially be interested in whether you can reach policymakers on that route as well. We'll go into other routes that you have as well, but is there any discernible effect on policymakers on that social media level?
Yeah, I believe as well, especially in the commission, they're quite active, for example, on LinkedIn, which is our strongest social media channel. So we do have, within following, but also in terms of being in that same bubble of communication. For example, parliament members, they're mostly on X, which we also leverage. So we do try to target different people also in terms of topics, but also in terms of timing. Right now, we're focusing a lot on bioeconomy because the Commission is planning to update their strategy for bioeconomy. And until now, plant breeding has been completely absent from that strategy. So It's our mission to make sure that it gets into the update this year.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. And that's actually maybe a nice point to look at an analysis that you've done with Plans for the Future. You've looked at basically 20 years of funding history, European investment for plant breeding in research and innovation. And you've discovered a couple of trends. Maybe we can jump into that. So what is one of the most important trends maybe that you've identified?
Yes, the European Union organizes these big framework programs that last about 7 years. And then they basically are supposed to fund collaborative research across Europe and also try to deliver on policy goals. So it's always a balancing act for the Commission, which is completely understandable in terms of delivering on the needs of research innovation, providing enough leeway for the communities to actually develop their own solutions without, narrowing that path too much, but also delivering on the policy goals. So we basically looked since 2007, that's the framework program number 7. And then we looked at that one through Horizon 2020 and the first half of Horizon Europe. So we're right in the middle of the third framework program. And we looked at how much money was put in total in those framework programs and how much of that went to specific projects covering plant breeding research. And when we talk about plant breeding research, it's really from the fundamental research on crops, on biological processes within crops. We didn't look at model species, but we restrained it to crops, but still the fundamental research, and all the way to developing new varieties. And there we basically found that although there is more money in plant breeding, or it has increased, it's only increased by 9% in the last 20 years. Whereas the total pot of money for the whole framework program has increased by 42%. Which basically means that the allocation of funds to plant breeding has been decreasing in terms of like the ratio of money that goes there.
So the relative.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. So what does that mean for research and innovation in this sector?
Well, it means that we're not tapping into the potential that plant breeding can provide. There's a huge potential. And I think the biggest challenge, and also to explain to especially policymakers, is that breeding a new variety takes a very long time. It's basically, for example, wheat, which we consider a relatively easy crop because it's so well developed, it takes 10 years to bring a new variety to market. And now when we're talking about sustainability and diversifying our food, our feed, and also the production and rotations, we're talking about underutilized crops, potentially niche crops, plant protein crops. And those are maybe 15, 20 or more years until they would reach the market if we started the research now. And so those are enormous timelines. And it's not something that companies would invest in because you also have to consider if we have more species, then we have less acreage per species. So there's less return on investment. Yeah, there's less return on investment. And in the end, it's a business. So basically, there needs to be more investment from the public sector to get that basic research going so that there's enough knowledge that then the companies will be able to take that up into their breeding programs. So we're talking a lot about the need for public-private collaborations. And we saw in our study as well that, for example, for Horizon 2020, we finished in 2020. They basically did an assessment in terms of participation of the private sector. And for the whole program, they saw that 28% of the funds went to the private sector, which is an increase compared to the previous one, which is very good. So there's more participation of the private sector. But when we looked specifically at plant breeding research, it was only 20%, which means that there's actually a big difference in terms of how much participation there is specifically in plant breeding compared to the bigger pot. we've talked a little bit to our private members from the industry, in
And
their
so just about to
participation.
go there.
Exactly, because that was our first question. Why is that? So we
Mhm.
noticed one thing when we were actually, because we also looked at how the consortia were built up, how the money was distributed, because that's all
Mhm.
public knowledge. And we found that in average, a private partner in a consortium will receive half the amount of funds that a public partner will. Of course, there's probably a lot of different reasons for that, and it wasn't the purpose of our study, but we did ask a little bit, and some anecdotal feedback was that usually there's not enough money to go around. And so for the sake of being part of the project, the private partner will accept to take less and provide more in-kind contribution. But we've also heard from them in general that the administrative burden linked to being part of these projects is enormous. And we have a few that have been part of projects in the past and have literally told us we are not doing that ever again until there's a massive change in how these projects are managed.
Oh.
So,
but
it's a shame.
It's a shame, but also a huge challenge, because you can kind of see how, all of these variables together make for quite a complex setup. Have you identified maybe areas where you can help policymakers, thinking of the strategy changes you alluded to earlier, but also maybe the next funding programs? What can they do? Are there concrete steps they can take to make this better, to increase participation or a motivation to participate?
Yeah, I think, simplification, that's always something. And that's something that the Commission has put on their radar and is planning to do with the whole omnibus package. And we hope that that will also affect the next framework program for research. But then basically what we see now, at least in terms of plant breeding, is that we have a few projects or a few proposals or calls for projects. And then a handful of projects are funded. And that's all well and good. People do their projects and then they're done. And then that's it. There are no follow-up projects, and often these projects last in average 4 to 5 years. And again, if you're thinking about what I was saying, the fact that it takes decades actually to breed new varieties, a project of 4 to 5 years just barely gets you started. So we're suggesting either longer projects, but that's also, there's a risk as well, because if the project's not successful and you've funded a 10-year project, that's a waste of resources, and this is taxpayer money. So another way that I think could be quite interesting is having dedicated funding for follow-up projects. So basically a 3+3+3. I know in Germany, they actually have that system in some cases where you do a first 3-year project, it's assessed, and then you get renewed for another 3 years and again assessed and renewed. And that could potentially lead up to a 9 to 10-year project. And then you start getting into something that's really very usable, where you can really address the entire research to innovation, to product or service or benefit, potentially the whole, if not the whole, but at least getting close enough that you have uptake from the private sector to then make that last step. We've also seen, but
I was just thinking it sounds almost
ahead.
like there could even be milestones, that it's almost like there's a framework for how to set up this kind of project. So it's not just a timeline, but also that you could say, okay, the first 3 years are for basic research, for identifying maybe promising strains. And then the next one would be about the application. And then the third would be towards going towards market.
Exactly. It's really, so we've also looked in our study on TRL level, so the technical readiness level. It's the only way we found that is standardized to measure how close to market different research results are. And we've seen that that's varied quite a bit. So for example, the framework programs do cover the entire from TRL 1 to I think 9 is the highest. But it varies quite a bit, and also in terms of how much money, because the closer you get to market, the more expensive it is as well. But that's also where there's more interest from the private sector, and where there might be a benefit, also a bigger benefit from the private sector to provide the in-kind contribution, because there might be a monetary, interest after the project. So I think there's a lot of different models. There's a lot of countries that do it in different ways. So Germany, I mentioned, Denmark also does a lot of public-private partnerships, the Netherlands, France. And they are also, not surprisingly, one of our biggest seed sector countries, at least in Western Europe. And so I think there's a lot that could be learned on how things are done at the national level that needs to be brought up to European level as well. Because we also saw that there's a lot of countries that are being left behind. For example, Eastern Europe is almost completely absent in these projects. And
Why is that?
Well, I don't know for sure. I think there's less investment in research. There's less activity in breeding. In some cases, it's mostly government funded breeding that is done. So maybe the private sector is not so present there. But we have heard from people from Eastern Europe that they don't necessarily have the best varieties that are adapted to their conditions. They basically use varieties that have been bred for other conditions in other places in Europe, and then they use them there. So they're not optimizing as well. They have a bigger yield gap that we'd see in other parts in Europe. And there actually lies a huge potential when we're talking about a transition to more sustainability and lower inputs, because obviously lower inputs will mean, at least in the short to medium term, lower production. And that we need to acknowledge. And we also don't want to start importing more, because in the end, we'll be importing from countries that need that food more than us. And so it's, again, an untapped potential that we need to also leverage better in Europe, basically breeding more varieties specifically for these countries and helping them increase their production. And that can help compensate for perhaps a reduction in production that we have in other places.
Do you focus on the possibilities that technological advances bring with these projects specifically? I'm thinking AI, obviously, as one big area where the whole sector is changing and profiting from.
Yeah, so we haven't focused specifically on AI, but it is definitely something, and we hear it from our members. I think in some cases, people know it's there and they want to use it and they know it will be groundbreaking, but nobody yet really knows how to use it or how to leverage it completely. I think there are some startups and others providing different services as well to help that. But in terms, for example, of plant breeding innovation, so again, getting into the more breeding parts, we have gene editing, or as it's named now at EU level, new genomic techniques. Those can provide a huge, jump forward, because instead of having to cross different varieties, so a commercial variety with a less interesting variety, but that might have a resistance that we would like to tap into, instead of having to then do what we call the back crosses to get rid of the genetic material that we're not interested in and enrich the genetic material that has all the interesting traits like juicier fruit or tastier fruit or higher yields, that's the part that takes the longest in breeding, actually. And so using gene editing, we could just see, well, this gene is slightly different in that variety compared to this variety, and that's responsible for that resistance. So we'll just tweak this commercial variety to make it similar, and then we're done. Then it still goes through all the testing that we would normally do with conventional breeding, but you can actually reduce that first step by years, if not a decade, depending on which species you're working on.
So is this one of the areas where you're strongly, I guess, advising policymakers? Because there's obviously still in Europe maybe certain pockets or even bigger areas that are quite resistant to this idea of new genomic techniques, and the innovation readiness maybe could be advanced a little bit.
Yeah, so basically, since 2020, the Commission was asked by the Council to launch a study to assess whether gene editing or whether the GMO directive was still fit for purpose to address these new methods like gene editing. And so that was when I started at Plants for the Future. So that was also an interesting time to be part of it from the very beginning. There were a lot of consultations, a lot of discussions, a lot of studies looking at the ethics of it, at the science behind it, the safety, of course, and also at the potential of what these methods could bring for our food systems and sustainability. And so it was decided that we needed a specific legislation to address what they then called new genomic techniques. And so since then, since 2021, there was again another process where the Commission had to develop a legislative proposal, which was published in 2023, summer 2023. And since then, it's been with the Parliament and with the Council so that they basically could assess that proposal and agree in their respective institutes on another or an improved, or what they consider an improved text. And then eventually they would come together and have what we call the trilogues, at least in EU bubble speak, which means the negotiation between the Parliament, the Council, and the Commission, each with their respective version of the same text, and then to discuss, well, what would the end text look like that they can all agree on. And we're actually potentially at the cusp of something this week. It's very exciting because it's been a very long ride. As I said, it was published in summer 2023. Within a little more than 6 months, the Parliament was able to adopt their version of the text, just before the elections. And it's actually been stuck in council since. And there seems to be, the deadlock seems to have been broken. And we hope that this Friday at a council meeting, we're all expecting a very expectation in terms that they will come to a common agreement and we can finally get into trilogues.
So this is maybe a point for our audience. We're recording this on March 11th. You will be hearing this a little later. So hopefully, fingers crossed, this prediction will come true. And obviously, we'll have links in our show notes to Plan for the Future, to your info hub and main page, as well as social media presence. So everyone hop on over and see if if this prediction has come true and where we're at with the developments. Amrit, I'm also interested, you mentioned quite early on, you're a membership-based organization, nonprofit organization. How do you engage with the wider community?
So engaging with the wider community as in society or the community, the sector, or...
Both are interesting, but first the community that's kind of basically your members and or people who might become members. How do you address their questions, their concerns? Basically, how are you in communication with them?
Yeah, so we work very closely together with our members. We have different working groups. We identify different topics of interest that we want to deep dive on and give our perspective on. So, for example, we had a working group on sustainable agriculture that ran for a number of years. And actually, in February, we published one of the last works of that working group, which is our take on an implementation strategy for increasing plant protein production in the EU. Because that's been a long-going discussion that we want to cut the imports of soy, especially from Latin America, for a lot of different reasons. But the bottom line is that it's just cheaper. And so how can we increase the production in the EU so that it's at some point gets competitive enough and of interest enough for European farmers, but also food retailers and the feed sector to basically use the EU-grown plant protein. So we come up with a number of different suggestions. We highlight the main barriers. So that was published, beginning of February. And we're going to leverage this document to try to help the Commission because they've been talking about developing a strategy. It's always a little bit, will the Commission develop a EU-wide strategy? Or would they recommend for the countries, the member states, to do it themselves? And so far, it's more been the second, where specific member states have come up with their strategy at national level. And that's all well and good. But again, in the same way as the breeding, it's again the usual suspects that come up with it and that have the funds as well. And in our opinion, it doesn't make sense for every member state to work on their 3 or 4 favorite plant protein crops in isolation. It would make sense to identify a handful of crops that make sense for Northern Europe, for Western Europe, for South of Europe, building them up.
Eastern Europe,
Eastern Europe, exactly. The different regions that have similar climatic conditions will benefit from developing the same species and actually pooling their resources to do the basic research that will take maybe 5 to 10 years until we start to get to something that is relevant.
Right. So if I understood you correctly, members can participate in work groups and actually become part of the power, the science base to policy changes, to policy making.
Exactly. Basically, so we are a very small team. It's myself and my research and communication officers. So we're very small and we rely on the expertise of our members. So we're here to guide them and to help them put their knowledge in the context of the policy situation and highlight different opportunities. So, for example, I mentioned the bioeconomy strategy. So we see that now there's an update on the bioeconomy strategy. So there's an opportunity to leverage that. And so we will guide our members to basically help us provide science-based recommendations, information, raising awareness to the relevant people. We also involve our members. Also, we do a lot of awareness raising with the parliament as well. I haven't mentioned that as much, especially in the last couple of years on NGTs. And there we bring our members. We have lunch seminars where we explain what plant breeding is, because it doesn't make sense to talk about a very, very specific technique in plant breeding without even knowing what plant breeding is about.
Right.
Because in the end, it's all an evolution of different methods becoming more and more precise. And actually, the more we know, the more we can do. So if you just look at the last thing we did, it doesn't make sense if you don't know why we got there or how we got there.
That makes total sense. Amrit, I wish we could talk for another hour. This is so interesting. But maybe as a final question, because we see the power that your members wield through your help and through channeling it through your organization. How can institutions or individuals become members of Plans for the Future ETP?
Also, institutions, companies, or organizations, associations can become members. We do not have individual members. We don't have the capacity for that, simply put. But we welcome any new members. Anybody who works in the plant sector and has an interest to be part of this community is very welcome to reach out to us and basically discuss a potential membership.
Perfect. So let's take that as an invitation to our Computomics podcast community out there. Check out the show notes. We'll have all the links for you. And if you aren't a member yet, you can become one. And we thank you so much for this conversation.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening in today. Want to learn more? Then check out our show notes and more info on computomics.com. If you have questions or want to propose a next guest, please reach out to us at podcast@computomics.com.